Everybody knows video games are bad for society. That is a statement which many believe is true. Through media, people seemingly think that video games are no good and see them as a negative. However, that is just a myth. Today I'll be discussing a component of this myth, which is that violent video games make people more violent. Most studies that tell you violent video games make people more violent are limited in evidence and based on ridiculous findings. While there are cases where violent video games have contributed to violence or even murder, it's usually because there were many other significant factors and video games were simply just a seasoning on top. An article written by Richard Gulleton from The Australian is a prime example of this. A 14-year-old named Ryan Miller had murdered a 63-year-old lady by stabbing her multiple times. Miller was a big fan of games such as Saints Row, Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. These games are very popular worldwide and are very violent. Miller would play these games every day, have fun, as every other 14-year-old kid would. It is believed that Miller's addiction to violent video games was the key influence to him committing murder. Apparently, it's not normal for a 14-year-old kid to continuously play violent video games. And the fact that Grand Theft Auto is the highest all-time selling video game is just a coincidence. Here are some astonishing facts which we did not know about Miller. He had an extremely low IQ and an intellectual deficit, borderline retardation. His parents were involved in a violent relationship full of fighting both verbally and physically. He was often exposed to domestic violence and was bullied at school his whole life. As you can see, Miller's life was not a typical 14-year-old's. And based on all of these factors, it is believed that violent video games were the key reason for his murder. This is ridiculous. I am not saying video games did not contribute a single bit, but you cannot tell me that on top of all of Miller's conditions, they were the decider. Forensic psychologist Luke Bromhall says playing violent video games can temporarily increase aggression, but there is little research that shows video games cause violence. Furthermore, Christopher Ferguson, a psychologist and a researcher of the effects of video game violence, points out that many cases supporting the correlation of video game violence are not true. Studies which incorporate all risk factors show that violent video games have no link to violence whatsoever. Another study of youth violence finds that mental health problems are the primary predictor of adverse outcomes, not violent video games or even television. Therefore, it is evident that violent video games were not the reason for Miller's murder. Studies which prove violent video games cause violence are comical and absurd. A study conducted at Iowa State University by psychologist Christopher Barrett is an excellent example of irrelevant conclusions. The university's study consisted of two groups of students, one playing non-violent video games and the other playing violent video games. After they finished playing the games for 15 minutes, both groups were told that they have to put hot sauce on a colleague's meal, who both groups were told that that colleague did not particularly like spicy food. The study found that students who engaged in violent video games as opposed to students who participated in non-violent video games gave significantly bigger portions of hot sauce to the student. Based on this, they concluded violent video games cause violence. I mean, how ludicrous is this conclusion? How can you compare hot sauce with violence in any way, shape or form? The irrationality and stupidity of this experiment proves my point that studies which show video games promoting violence are irrelevant and comical. Adding on, experimental studies found that effects which support video game violence are more likely to be published than studies which had found none. It could be argued that there is a bias in available resources on the topic. Violence in video games has been increasing ever since their invention, yet violence in the world has been decreasing. Christopher Ferguson tells us that our kids today are the least violent, most civically involved, least likely to use drugs, and most likely to graduate from secondary education. Clearly, the increasing violence in video games is not having an impact on society. This discussion looked at the link between playing violent video games and violence in our society. It was concluded that playing violent video games does not make you any more violent. The widely believed statement, "everybody knows video games are bad for society," in relation to violent video games is false based on today's findings.